Hello everyone, and welcome to today's episode in the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I'm Alexandre Moylan of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today we're joined by Professor Tobias Lenz to discuss his book, Interorganizational Diffusion in International Relations, Regional Institutions and the Role of the European Union, published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. Tobias Lenz is Professor of International Relations at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. His research focuses on international and regional governmental organizations, the European Union and global regionalism, international institutional complexity, institutional design and evolution, legitimacy and legitimation, and diffusion theories. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Kolja Raube, Assistant Professor for European Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at KU Leuven. He's also Senior Fellow at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. Kolja Raube has published widely on the European Parliament, interparliamentary cooperation, and the European Union in global governance, as well as the rule of law, legitimacy, and coherence in EU external action. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Tobias of about 25 minutes, and then Kolja will have the opportunity to start the discussion with some questions and comments. Tobias will then have the opportunity to reply. We will then turn to questions from the audience, so please feel free to send your questions to me throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function at the bottom of the webinar window. I will collect your questions to then share with our speakers following their presentations. Let me just begin with a few words about the GLOBE project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to 4 key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The 3.5-year project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as look ahead at 2030 and 2050 in order to equip policymakers with the tools they will need to deal with future challenges. On behalf of the GLOBE project, I would really like to thank both Tobias and Kolja for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Tobias. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction and the invitation. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about my book today at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, because I think that this book directly speaks to some of the issues that you have and continue to so successfully research at the KUL. That is, in my presentation today, I think fits into that broader research agenda by focusing specifically on regional organizations and ask questions about the ways in which they're kind of set up or designed, if you want. So I'll share a little presentation. You should be able to see the presentation now, right?
It's very good.
So this is the cover of the book. The book asks a number of questions about the influence of the European Union on regional organizations or regional institution building, as I call it in the book, in other parts of the world. And I've got a long-standing interest in the topic. This all started 10, 15 years ago with a PhD at Oxford University, and I've then continued doing research on it. And I've summarized, let's say, these 10 to 15 years of research in this book now. The book offers a mixed methods design that draws on both quantitative data, a large data set that I'll talk a little bit about, as well as individual and comparative case studies, in order to make a compelling case that we should take the EU's influence on processes of institution building seriously. And this book is indeed an open access publication, which means that you can download it for free from the OUP or my own website if you are interested. Maybe you've already done so. So these are the research questions that the book addresses, 3 overall. It asks, to what extent the EU, or does the EU shape regional institution building in other parts of the world? How specifically does that influence operate in terms of the underlying causal mechanisms? And then finally, under what conditions is this influence most likely to operate or materialize? So what are the scope conditions of the argument, as it were? And I want to start out by saying a little bit about why I think these questions are important to address. Then I'll say a little bit about theory, present some quantitative results from the quantitative test, look a little bit at the causal mechanisms, and present some insights from a case study on the Southern African Development Community, and finish, hopefully after or before 25 minutes, with some of the theoretical implications of the argument. So one reason why I think these questions are important to address is that interest in the EU's influence on regional institution building has been long-standing. Essentially, since the beginning of the field of comparative regionalism, say in the late 1950s, early 1960s, shortly after the EU's founding, there are a number of claims such as the ones that you can read here are really widespread in much of the literature. So there's a lot of kind of casual claims about the EU's influence out there, but very few systematic analyses, right? Take this example by Gibb, 2009, third one on the slide, African regionalism. He writes, has been pursued both theoretically and empirically in terms of a neoliberal free market and Westphalian state model built upon the experiences, values, and norms of European integration, right? So very few people have bothered to kind of analyze whether these claims are actually true, what they mean specifically, and under what conditions they might hold. Now, I think a second kind of motivation, say, for the project is that we can observe specific institutional similarities between the European Union and other regional organizations. Here you see the example of the African Union, a much quoted example, in fact, whose institutional framework is quite similar to that of the European Union. And interesting about these institutions or bodies is that they're not only named after their counterparts in the EU, but they also possess some similar competencies. So for example, the African Union Commission also holds an exclusive right to propose legislation, as does the European Commission, right? And various authors have noted these institutional similarities. Here are a couple of quotes to that effect. But we know relatively little about whether that is actually an instance of diffusion, or might just reflect some kind of adaptation to similar functional demands, let's say, in the two regions, and how widespread such similarities actually are. And then finally, and probably well known to many of you that you work on the European Union and global governance more broadly, the European Union has for many decades now actively supported regional institution building in many parts of the world. And it's quite well documented that it uses a range of policy tools in order to support processes of regional integration, development aid, interregional trade and cooperation agreements, as well as group-to-group political dialogues. But we know relatively little about how successful many of these activities have actually been. So has the EU managed to achieve its goals? And I'll come back to that question when I conclude. So taken together, I think there's good reason to inquire in more, say, detail, maybe with more sophisticated research design or more elaborate research design, into whether and how the European Union shapes regional institution building around the world. Then let me move on to some core concepts or a little bit of theory. I conceptualize the influence of the European Union on other regional organizations as a form of diffusion. And diffusion is generally defined in the literature as a process of interdependent decision-making, which simply means that we're unable to understand a certain political decision unlike we take connections between different organizations into account. Here you see the cover of my book once again, and in fact that cover tries to capture that idea of interdependent decision-making or diffusion by highlighting the interconnections and interactions that exist between different regional organizations. And it asks how such interactions between organizations shapes their internal constitution, right? And so I draw on a very conventional distinction in the interorganizational literature, but other parts of IR as well, between direct and indirect interaction. A direct interaction is one that involves direct contacts between two sides, between two organizations, and an indirect interaction that the transfer of information, say about another organization, is mediated through a third party, be it a non-state actor or the media or whatever that is. Okay. So on the basis of that idea of diffusion and interaction between organizations, I derived two testable hypotheses. One on the EU's active influence, direct interaction, and one on the EU's passive influence or indirect interaction. The active EU influence hypothesis suggests that the more extensive engagement between the EU and other regional organizations is, the more likely we're going to see the development of stronger regional institutions over time. And I'll give you a little insight on why I think that interaction with the EU should generally strengthen institutions as opposed to just making them, say, more similar to those in the EU in a little bit. The reason here is kind of twofold. One is that the EU, through its active support, generates incentives for other regional organizations to strengthen their institutions, and the very contacts that exist between the EU and other organizations may also induce processes of socialization in which policymakers elsewhere become convinced that following EU institutional models is useful for their own process. And the second hypothesis that I look at is the idea that as the EU's own institutional development progresses over time, as the EU continues to build its own institutions, other organizations might follow suit. And this is due to the idea that there can be learning effects, that they can look at the EU and learn the types of effects that EU institutions have had and agree that that would be a useful thing to see in their own regions, say regarding the usefulness of a strong dispute settlement mechanism in order to enforce compliance with regional rules. But this may also be due to kind of legitimacy considerations and the legitimacy benefits that policymakers and other regional organizations expect to derive or receive from emulating EU institutional designs. And then in addition to these kind of EU influence hypotheses, they also ask about the conditions, as I mentioned, under which such influence is likely to occur. And here I look at the effects of the nature of the founding contracts that these regional organizations rest on. So any regional organization rests on a formal contract where member states agree to bind themselves to a set of rules, including a set of institutions. And what I think is interesting about these contracts is that they vary in the types of open-ended commitments or the extent to which they contain open-ended commitments. By open-ended commitments, I mean that member states commit to various degrees to open-ended processes of regional cooperation. So in what I call fixed contracts, member states try to agree from the outset the goal of cooperation that they strive towards, say the establishment of a free trade agreement in a region. And in other regional organizations, member states commit to just engaging or addressing the types of problems that confront to them as they cooperate with each other. So the final or ultimate goal of cooperation is open-ended, is unknown in other types of organizations. And these open-ended commitments, as I call them, have two effects that make EU influence generally more likely to occur and thereby bound that idea of EU influence. One is that open-ended commitments make it easier to develop institutions over time. And so when institutional change is more frequent, it's also more likely that this change will be influenced by the EU. And on the supply side, open-ended commitments make it easier for proponents of EU-type institutional change to argue that EU-type institutions are useful to have in that region. So analogies to the EU become more credible. Right, and so a third hypothesis that I test stipulates that the more open-ended the contracts are upon which regional organizations rest, the more likely is EU influence to lead to stronger regional institutions. So much for theory, and I'll walk you a little bit through the quantitative test of these arguments, as well as then the case study that looks at some of the causal mechanisms, right? So I try to test these hypotheses on a sample of 36 regional organizations in the period from 1950, see before the EU was actually founded, until 2017, taken from the Measure of International Authority data set by Hoch and al. I was involved in creating that. And the dependent variable that I look at is what I term institutionalization, the degree of institutionalization of these various regional organizations. By institutionalization, I mean the delegated competencies that bodies, individual bodies in these organizations have in agenda setting, final decision making, and dispute settlement. Looking at these four types of bodies that you see here: general secretariats, parliamentary bodies, judicial bodies, and what I call consultative bodies, such as labor and business councils, that sometimes have a say in decision making and agenda setting in some organizations. And as you might notice, these four bodies are also what makes kind of the EU in many ways distinctive, right, as a regional organization. So here you see some of the sample variation of these 36 regional organizations. The kind of black dots are the mean value of institutionalization over the entire period. And these gray box plots give you a sense of how much change there is over time. And you see that the EU is at the very top. So the EU is the most institutionalized regional organization in the sample, and probably in the world overall. This is fairly well established, if only by intuition, right? And that's why I expect, as they engage with the EU, to create stronger regional institutions, right? And as we see, there's quite a bit of variation, both in between regional organizations as well as over time. Some organizations start approaching, say, the EU's level of institutionalization, such as the Andean Community or the East African Community. And then other regional organizations, which you see at the bottom, Southern African Customs Union or Comecon, the former communist economic organization, dead by now, don't have much institutionalization at all, right? And so I'm trying to explain variation in institutionalization by primarily looking at the EU's active and passive influence. The EU's active influence I measure through an index that I can say a little bit more about, where I try to identify the amount of funding that the EU gives to organizations in any year, the extent to which it has interregional agreements, and institutionalized contacts. And in fact, these three measures of active EU influence hang quite well together. The Cron-Bus alpha is something like 0.86, which indicates high scalability. Now for passive EU influence, I'm using a simple measure, let's say, which is the EU's own degree of institutionalization. And then open-ended contracts measures the open-ended nature of commitments, which I've already mentioned on 2 dimensions. To what extent is the policy scope that these organizations have open-ended, and to what extent is cooperation focused exclusively on governments as opposed to people, communities more broadly, right? And this is an ordinal measure with 3 categories. Then we've got open-ended, intermediate, and fixed contracts. Here are some of the results of the statistical analysis. These come from an OLS regression with RO fixed effects, unit fixed effects, and robust standard errors. So I'm looking primarily at change over time. And as you see here, the EU's active influence is positively signed and highly statistically significant. So this is model, say, 2, 5, and 7. And then passive influence, so the EU's own institutional development seems to shape or is correlated with institutionalization in other regional organizations. And for both of these types of influence, the interaction term with contractual open-endedness, right, models 3 and 5, is primarily works for those organizations that rest on open-ended contracts. So really what the EU influences primarily, both actively and passively, is those organizations that rest on open-ended contracts. And in that sense are similar to the EU in the way in which they approach, say, regional integration from the outset. We can talk a little bit about the robustness checks or alternative explanations. You see here the control variables that are listed. Host of controls that I control for here that try to capture both specific characteristics of the organizations themselves, as well as, say, broader influences from the international system, globalization, regional diffusion, the Cold War, and so on. All right, then I'll say a little bit about the causal mechanism in a case study, okay? What I hypothesize in terms of the causal mechanism is that the EU's influence operates through the bargaining positions of national governments. National governments, so I look at the creation and change in formal institutions, which involve treaty change, right? And these treaties are negotiated by national governments themselves, often exclusively, in fact. These are general intergovernmental conferences at which treaty changes are negotiated, at which, you know, general secretariats and non-state actors really have no role to play. And this is similar in the EU as well as other regional organizations. And the EU is not sitting at the negotiation table when this happens, right? So the idea here is that this influence operates by way of shaping governments' bargaining positions that they bring to the table when they negotiate international change, right? In a way, it's a very kind of intergovernmental framework that I draw up here and theorize in terms of the causal underlying mechanism, right? And I'm going to try to illustrate to you now this active EU influence mechanism in the case of the Southern African Development Community. The Southern African Development Community is a regional organization in South Africa, of which South Africa itself is a part, as well as many of the neighboring states. And this organization established a tribunal, the so-called SADC tribunal, in the year 2000. Now, what is interesting about this tribunal is that it's very similar to the European Court of Justice. Karen Alter has done work on this where she calls the SADC tribunal one of, I think, 11 ECJ copies that exist around the world. And she bases that assessment on kind of 3 features of the SADC tribunal. Namely that it can bring non-compliance suits through a supranational commission. There is some kind of preliminary rulings mechanism in SADC, and there is an explicit right to constitutional review. And you see the SADC tribunal down here, a little picture of it. And I'll say a little bit about the after history, as it were, of that tribunal, because it doesn't exist anymore today. Now, I think the SADC tribunal is kind of interesting in and of itself, but there's also some good reasons to select the SADC tribunal, which have to do with the way in which specific factors that might shape dispute settlement design play out in SADC. So from the perspective of the EU diffusion argument, EU influence is likely. And that's partially because the EU's long had intensive contact with SADC, and the scope condition that I've hypothesized an open-ended contract is present in that case. Whereas from the perspective of established alternative explanations, we would not expect to see the emergence of a fairly strongly institutionalized dispute settlement mechanism due to strong sovereignty concerns on the part of member states, high power asymmetry, low levels of democracy, and so on. Right. So I think the SADC tribunal case conforms rather closely to what John Gehring has called a crucial case that enables researchers to isolate the effect of alternative explanations largely by design. In such cases are particularly useful to look at underlying causal mechanisms. All right, and what I do now is what we might call a process analysis. That is, I look at the establishment of the tribunal over time. Here you see some of the landmark moments, say, in the establishment of the SADC tribunal, starting in 1992 and reaching all the way to its inauguration in 2006. And I try to identify, by reconstructing that process, how and at which steps in the process the EU influence has actually shaped what was going on kind of on the ground, how it's shaped actors' bargaining positions. And I've looked here at the entire documentation of SADC meetings since the beginning of that organization, at foreign policy documents, also from the EU side, and have conducted a number, about a dozen interviews with some of the key players in this process. Right? I'm going to give you kind of a short glimpse because I'm running out of time, I realize. The story I tell about the establishment of the SADC tribunal is one in which 2 collective preferences of member states increasingly come into conflict with each other, let's say. So I argue that member states share 2 collective preferences. One is to design largely sovereignty preserving institutions, and the other one is to secure financial support from external partners. Initially, in these member states fight against apartheid South Africa, but that continues after South Africa itself becomes a member of SADC. And whereas the EU and other international partners largely made it possible for member states to pursue these 2 preferences kind of in tandem for about the first decade of SADC. In the 1990s, these 2 things increasingly clash. And that, I argue, is due to the fact, in large part, because the EU starts arguing vis-a-vis policymakers in SADC that it will only continue funding the organization if they institutionalize. And member states then decide to weigh preference 2, continued support, more heavily, let's say, than their preference for sovereignty preserving institutions. And one can trace that kind of clash of preferences and the increasing, say, move towards prioritizing preference 2 quite nicely. Here's a couple of kind of glimpses. This is more extensive in the book itself. But it's interesting that the very first proposal for the SADC tribunal, which only has a very vague stipulation in the 1992 treaty, it only says we're going to establish a tribunal, essentially, with all the details to be decided in a later protocol. So when they start work on this protocol, the kind of initial proposal for it comes from a former ECJ Advocate General, Francis Jacobs. And then there is much talk about how the organization is afraid of the EU withdrawing funding. Now, I couldn't make out that the EU ever formally tied its continued financial support to that condition. So I don't think the EU ever put conditionality on it, but it did convey, in whatever way, that it expects SADC to institutionalize in order to continue receiving funds. And one can trace that through the documents that I've looked at, that there is a fear on the part of policymakers that the EU withdraws funding, and that funding then, or that fear of the EU withdrawing funding has something to do with the establishment of the tribunal that the EU heavily supports in terms of financial and technical aid, right? And then you can find interview quotes by important actors that say, yeah, one major reason why the SADC established its tribunal is to get funds from the European Union and others. So I think the SADC is one kind of quite compelling case in which the EU actively contributes to the building of stronger regional institutions in other regions. But this has come at a cost, and this is where my theoretical implications start, my final slide. So I do find that, yes, under certain conditions, open-ended commitments, EU foreign policy in terms of supporting regionalism, I think has achieved some of its goals in terms of strengthening regional organizations, yet sometimes only in the short run. Right? And this is the SADC case where that tribunal was essentially abolished because member states realized how sovereignty constraining the tribunal was. We'll talk more about this if you want, and have decided to abolish it again after about 7 years of actual operation. Nevertheless, and this is more on the kind of passive or indirect side, you know, harking back to Ian Manner's famous concept of the EU as a normative power, I think we might say that the EU has changed what counts as normal, say, in the realm of regional integration, and that strongly institutionalized forms of regionalism have gained some normality, if that is a word at all, in international politics. And then finally, it strikes me that one of the reasons why EU integration theories might have difficulty to be applied and to become popular, as it were, outside of the EU itself. So I'm thinking here of neo-functionalism and liberal intergovernmentalism, might be that they largely neglect diffusion dynamics. So one of the things that I think is quite important for understanding regional institution building in other parts of the world is simply not part of the EU's own integration theories. So that for me is a third and final theoretical implication that we might want to pick up on. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you to you, Tobias, for sharing this fascinating research. I would like to thank and also our audience for staying with us, and also remind them that indeed we will be going on to the Q&A rather soon, so please do send us your questions. And it's my pleasure, of course, now to give the floor to Kolja.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tobias, for first of all for writing this book, because I think even though you already said it's bringing together all your work, and people have, I assume, followed your work for many years now, is really bringing together your very insightful work on the building of regional organizations and institutions. So I would also like to applaud you for that, congratulate you, and also for making it open access. I think this is great. I had the pleasure of reading parts of the book, and I was really, as somebody who has studied the EU myself, very much taken by your arguments. It's very clearly argued. The theoretical framework is very nicely elaborated, and also the critique that you have against standing, let's say, major theories of regionalization is very well established and elaborated. So I can only congratulate you to that. I would also like to point, of course, to a couple of things you've mentioned now in your presentation, and perhaps, you know, just ask you a couple of follow-up questions out of curiosity to perhaps also see to which degree you can tell us more on that. You have basically very clearly shown that you were interested in explaining institutionalization and how the active and passive role of the EU matters here in the institutionalizations of other regional organizations outside the EU. And you also come up with that finding, right? That in fact the EU matters, especially in that open contract context, and that the EU is very much able to basically here and there help other regional organizations, to put it that way, to institutionalize, to actually grow, and perhaps to give more contractual clarity to their making. The point, what I wanted to say is you pointed to Francis Jacob, of course, as an individual, but perhaps we can focus on EU actors. Which EU actors matter really in that context, right? Perhaps you can say a little bit more about that. Who in that quite difficult EU external context, right? We have many different actors in EU external action, is actually here holding the key to convince other regions of institutionalization. The Commission, probably you can say something more about that. And as you know, I'm particularly also interested in the European Parliament. Have there been new actors on the rise over time that you can see coming in, adding to the, let's say, multi-actorness of the European Union in its approach towards that diffusion towards other regional organizations? So that's just a follow-up question, because I think, you know, your slide was so interesting and intriguing in that regard. The other question that I had was basically whether you can also, because you didn't mention that in your presentation, say a little bit more about the passiveness, the activeness over time, right? Your data goes back to the 1950s, right? That's your quantitative data to 2017. Perhaps you can say a little bit more about certain waves of involvement of the European Union and the way how it was able to shape. We can obviously, I guess, suspect that there are certain waves where the European Union has been more active and other ones where it was less active. But I would like to hear a little bit more from you about that, just because it was also so intriguing from your findings. And then last but not least, I think two questions or two comments on the, let's say, current state of affairs of global governance. Your data ends in 2017, and people have argued that from, let's say, 2011 to it depends who you ask, right? 2011 to some say 2014, 15. There's a dramatic change in international relations going on. There's greater contestation. There is a greater politicization going on, and in fact, people have argued this is a new liberal international order, right? That we are now in the face of post-national liberalism, one may argue, well, perhaps it's already post-liberal nationalism that has entered now the stage. So what does that mean, right? Because you claim that we have to look at a regional institutionalization in a contextual way in your book. So what is that broad context of a new, let's say, emerging confrontation of global orders, or let's say separate orders, telling us about the potential for future regional integration and institutionalization? To which degree will we see actors pushing for further regional regionalization, institutionalization, or do we rather expect states to take much more of a realistic approach, much more of an inward-looking, perhaps, approach that will actually not enable us to see that much regional institutionalization? And last but not least, Alex, if you allow me, one last comment. What if we look at the European Union as a beautiful nucleus that glows, right? That is shiny and that diffuses its beauty around the world. What if that shiny nucleus is going to darken and is actually losing its attractiveness? And I'm just asking because I'm curious whether your future research will look into that new period, perhaps, where we may no longer see the European Union being as actually much of an advocate externally, or perhaps you already have proof that it still continues to actually have a passive or perhaps even active, so to speak, influence on regional institutional needs. Thank you so much, Tobias, for your book and for the great presentation.
Yes, thanks, Kolja. I mean, thanks a lot for the praise, first of all. This is very kind. And these are excellent questions. I could talk for half an hour about them, and even then I don't think I would only scratch the surface. And in much of it, especially the questions about extrapolating from the book forward, of course, are not easy to answer at the current moment. Only time will tell is my hunch there, but I'll say a little bit more. So thank you very much for starting the discussion. Your first question was on the actors, which is a very important one. In fact, the theoretical framework that I'm trying to develop does look at actors, right? Many of the arguments about diffusion, increasing convergence between organizations and so on often are very kind of structural in nature, very kind of high macro level lead type arguments. And I'm really trying to dig down a little bit deeper and saying, who are the actors that do the diffusing, as it were, and the receiving on the other end? I've already mentioned a few in the story of SADC, and this is often not easy, let me be blunt, to really identify what were the crucial contexts and at what moments in time. Some of this is kind of trial and error, as it were, or by chance you meet someone who says, you know, at that meeting, I really learned this and this shaped my thinking. And sometimes you don't, and then you're digging a little bit in the dark. I think who matters on the EU side largely depends on the types of institutions we're talking about. So when we talk about the diffusion of say the European Parliament or the parliamentary forum to other regions, in fact, EP parliamentarians, MEPs, do play an important role. I've looked a little bit into the context that the EP itself has with other regions, and this is extensive. I mean, some of you have done research on this and probably know more, but for those of you who don't, you know, they meet quite a few of these regional parliaments on an annual or biannual basis, and they exchange for hours, if not days at a time, usually on general problems that both regions face. So they don't primarily talk about, you know, the institutional design of the regional parliament, but of course these things play a role. And European parliamentarians are often envied for the types of competencies and influence they have in the process of regional integration. And I've done some work on ASEAN myself, where I think I found some evidence that contacts with EU parliamentarians actually played a role in the activity that regional parliamentarians elsewhere developed in order to strengthen their own parliament. The European Commission plays a core role, not least through its financing of many of these regional integration initiatives, but also because much of the technical expertise that goes into designing institutions in other regions comes from the European Commission. So it's quite common that former commissioners, current commissioners, or in the lower ranks of the European Commission design proposals for institutional changes elsewhere, make suggestions on how things could be changed, share their knowledge and information on how EU institutions function. This is frequent in many organizations. And with the court, I've looked at a few courts. Visits to the ECJ are also quite frequent. So many of these organizations, sometimes before founding, sometimes after, visit the ECJ and learn about how dispute settlement in a regional organization works. So there's varied contexts at different levels, and I think they all contribute to what I'd call very kind of broadly EU influence. Your second question was on developments over time, and this is indeed interesting. So the EU's influence is not, relatively constant over the period that I look at, but comes in waves or maybe increases over time. So the EU starts engaging with other regional organizations from about the 1970s onwards. ASEAN was one of the first organizations where the EU had a kind of a structured exchange. The Andean Community, Central America was also one of them, quite strongly driven often by former colonial ties. And this starts kind of in the late 1970s, early 80s, but really takes off after the end of the Cold War. Right, so we're seeing an explosion of the EU support for regional integration really in the 1990s. And this has many reasons, partially geostrategic reasons, partially strategic reasons. So people in the Commission are kind of looking for a new role for the EU in the world and so on. And they think that the EU has something to contribute in that realm of regional integration. All the while regional integration seems to be exploding. Everyone is talking about free trade regional trade agreements, regional organizations, and so on. So the EU kind of goes into that niche, as it were, in the early 1990s. And since then, we've had a relatively, say, constant involvement of the EU. In fact, I updated some of the data recently of active EU influence, and I was somewhat surprised that I don't really see a kind of a dip. Funding is still up there. Interregional agreements are being negotiated. Mercosur is the most recent one that was successfully concluded after, I think, 20 years of negotiation. But people talk about it much less than they used to, which I think is interesting. I don't really know why that is, but it seems to me that the EU is still going fairly strong when it comes to supporting regionalism. Nevertheless, we're seeing kind of a flattening of the curve, as it were, in terms of the institutionalization of other regional organizations. So we recently did an update of the MIA data set and did find that between 2011 to 2020, that we've looked at, the increase is very modest. We don't see much backlash, which maybe one would expect, for all the backlash talk there is, but we don't see a kind of a strong increase. We see pretty much a flat curve there. And so one can ask if that, if EU influence, active EU influence continues at a high level, but not much is happening in terms of the institutionalization of other organizations. What that means kind of for the argument. And maybe one could argue that the active EU influence these days is really more geared towards maintaining existing levels of institutionalization as opposed to strengthening it. Recently came across a paper that I think made such an argument for the ASEAN community, which has really gone through repeated cycles of contestation and backlash and was on the brink of collapse quite a few times over the past 5-6 years. And EU support, from what I hear, was not insignificant in making sure that a minimal level of activity was maintained in the ASEAN community. Right. All right, looking into the future. Is that Milton Friedman? Nothing's as uncertain as the future. What does the current contestation about global order mean for the argument? I mean, my hunch is that there probably is a broad scope condition around all of the argument that I don't really look at, but that might matter in terms of, you know, in terms of the, say, reputation that regional integration has as a means of advancing state interests, right? And as international cooperation and regional integration, including, is entering rough waters, as it were, it might well be that EU influence, including its active influence, is just becoming less relevant for understanding the way in which institutions develop. That certainly is a possibility. It may be a kind of a presumption that that you also implied in your question, I'm not sure. Now, what is interesting though to see is that for all the crisis talk that we're seeing in the EU and in much of the West, right, the end of the liberal international order and so on, regional integration continues to thrive quite a bit in other parts of the world. So yes, there is talk for the kind of right-wing populist backlash. People like Bolsonaro in Brazil are causing trouble to regional organizations. But this is not a universal phenomenon, is my hunch. And so in Africa, for example, the talk about regional integration and African solutions to African problems through regional integration, to me, seems to be as strong as ever, really. And so there I don't see many signs that regional organization is kind of losing support, right? I think your second point is potentially more relevant. That is, when the EU is losing its shininess, as it were, does that not damage its global image, and therefore maybe it's passive influence, maybe it's active influence too. I don't know what the current discussions are in the Commission about that policy specifically, whether the EU wants to continue with that support or move money elsewhere. But is the EU losing attractiveness? I think it is. People have talked and continue to talk about the various crises that the EU has gone through. A common currency, for example, I think has taken quite a bit of a hit in the wake of the financial crisis, the euro crisis, and so on. So that probably has a negative effect. If that relates not just to individual policies, but to regional integration more broadly and institutionalization more broadly, I'm not sure. I know that the EU has weathered quite a few crises in its history. Some argue that the EU has come out stronger after crises than it was before, and that's probably part of the Commission strategizing in Brussels these days as well. How can we use the crisis in order to come out strong? So there, I would say only time can tell whether that dented image of the EU, which I share that impression over the past 10 years, is going to continue far into the future and really damage the EU's attractiveness kind of for good, as it were, or whether that will change again in a couple years' time once the EU kind of recovers or finds its place, say, in a new geopolitical competition between China and the US, because I think it is quite indispensable to many of the challenges that we're facing and continue to face over the next decades. So much Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you, Kolja, for that fascinating conversation. As you might have noticed, we're running slightly over time, but I hope our audience will stay with us as we indeed move on to addressing the questions from the audience. And there's 4 main interventions that I would like to put to you, Tobias. Would you prefer to have all the questions all at once, or perhaps go 2 by 2?
Yeah, let's do 2 by 2. That's a good idea.
2 by 2. Okay. So I'm going to start with 2 questions that relate to kind of the essentially the causal mechanisms that you identify. And the first one is bringing into the conversation the EU's diffusion and region building, which can be said to help increasing institutionalization and in turn also increase other regions' autonomy. If this is the case, can a reduction or absence of the EU's diffusion also be a consequence of its previous success, given the increased regional capacity of decision making? Second question, instead, in relation to the case that you mentioned of the tribunal, what about the kind of reverse institutionalization or deinstitutionalization? Is this an aspect that has been also incorporated in your research, in kind of explaining these elements of kind of lack or withdrawal of EU action in relation to institutional diffusion and how this affects regional organizations? Back to you.
Yeah, cheers. These are both very good questions. Let me start with the second on reverse institutionalization. I like that term. Now, SADC was a case that I've researched fairly deeply, and it seems to be an exceptional case in that way. So there is very few instances that I'm aware of where regional organizations really built back or abolished existing regional institutions. The SADC tribunal being one, probably the foremost one, the most well-known case. What happens much more frequently is that institutions continue to exist, but are just not being used very much, right? Where their influence is being curtailed in more informal ways. Funding is being withdrawn. You know, member states just don't listen and say to what they say. That type of thing. So formal abolishing of regional institutions is rare. Can I explain that? Or do I explain that in the book? Not really. All I argue is that within or in certain types of organizations, there is scope for EU diffusion, which as long as the EU continues to institutionalize and as long as the EU continues to put money to supporting regional institution building, I would expect to increase. But we do see these phenomena. I think there's little of a general pattern, but we do see them in individual instances. Can I explain them in an ad hoc fashion? Maybe. I think member states in SADC were really going for EU money in that case, which is one of the reasons why they anticipated, from everything I know, that they could curtail in many ways the tribunal in informal ways, right? So they said, we'll establish it, but we won't really give it a prominent role in the integration process, and thereby satisfy both demands, as it were. by both of these preferences. And then there came this funny case by a Zimbabwean farmer who was courageous enough, despite all the fear mongering that was going on in Zimbabwe at the time, to bring a case to the tribunal. And the judges were courageous enough to really rule against and declare illegal Zimbabwe's land reforms. So the kind of informal mechanisms didn't work particularly well in this case, you know, for reasons of individual actors, I really think. And they then took that step of eventually abolishing the tribunal, which was a little bit surprising. Not from the perspective of Zimbabwe. It was clear that Mugabe would try to do it, but that other member states would go along, especially South Africa, was a bit of a surprise. There's been much talk since to reestablish it, and from what I can see, there's some activism in South Africa to push policymakers in that direction. Not sure what this will lead to, but it is the exception that proves the rule, I would say, rather than really a general kind of phenomenon. Can the EU success, this was the other question, also be a consequence of this increasing institutionalization? I'm not sure I understood the question fully. But what strikes me is that few of the institutions that the EU has helped in establishing and pushing start assuming the roles that their counterparts in the EU often have. So that is, let's look at the parliaments, right? We see parliaments that have gotten some role, say, in the decision-making process, but I don't see that much activism similar to what European parliamentarians were doing in the 50s and 60s to really say, let's expand our competences. We want to be a legislator. We don't just want to be a consultative body within the institutional framework, right? So in many ways, they're pointing to the EU, but are then not really following up, which might indicate that there is some element of decoupling there, that you know, really they haven't internalized, let's say, the lessons to be learned from the EU, but that some of these similarities and activities are not as far-reaching, let's say, as there are in the EU itself, which I think supports the diffusion argument rather than vindicating it, in the sense that influence really comes from the outside. It's not something that actors in the regions themselves have deeply internalized and would do without that outside reference point. So much.
Excellent, thank you. And just very briefly on these two final questions. The first brings our attention to a specific case that is also mentioned in your book, which is EU influence on Mercosur. And there is debate these days that the EU-Mercosur trade agreement might actually increase regional building in South America, given the fact that Brazil and Argentina would finally have to agree on harmonization of trade standards and rules based on the EU's standards. Would this count as diffusion? Can you talk about diffusion in this context? And finally, a question that kind of relates a bit more to, I guess, kind of broader methodological questions. Concerning specifically the quantitative data in your analysis, do the results indicate causality in influence from the EU towards other regional organizations, or could they only really uncover interdependent behavior? Or indeed even the influence of other regional organizations on the EU? The audience member mentions that we could also think of a confounding variable such as a global script that affects the general type of these regional organizations, such as the EU and others, and so on and so forth. And it was indeed something I was thinking of also as you were kind of delving into the more quantitative side of your argument. But how do you really tease out causality when you're dealing with these kinds of quantitative databases? Of course, part of the answer, I suppose, is the process tracing and the more qualitative dimension of your research. But if you could delve a little bit more into that, I'd be very interested in hearing that. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for two other very good questions. Is harmonization an instance of diffusion? I would say yes, it is. The way I conceptualize diffusion is to say diffusion is interdependent decision making, as I said, short of imposition. And so to the extent that harmonization is a voluntary agreement, right, between two sides, that would be an instance of diffusion. And so I didn't look at specific trade rules as this participant is interested in, but at the organs in regional organizations more generally. But there is a few instances, and in fact in my PhD I looked at some of these, how negotiating with the EU at the same time builds the common market internally. So one of the things I remember is that the EU went into these negotiations saying, in order to be able to have an inter-regional trade agreement with Mercosur, your own customs union needs to be functioning, which wasn't the case at the time. We're talking about 10, 15 years ago, but I think it hasn't improved since then. It's rather gotten worse inside Mercosur. They didn't really have a coherent external tariff, only for some products. And they still had a range of controls when borders were crossing or goods were crossing borders within the region, which ought not to be the case. And so EU policymakers through the negotiations repeatedly said, in order to do that interregional deal, you need a functioning customs union first of all. And there was some ambition on the part of policymakers in Mercosur to really strengthen the own customs union and abolish what they call doble cobro, the kind of double tariff covering within the region as a result of that interregional negotiation. So for me, that, yes, is an instance of diffusion, of active EU influence, right? Causality. I mean, causality is a difficult term. And I know that in much of the cutting edge quantitative literature, there is probably better ways than what I can offer in this analysis to try to establish causality. So I wouldn't claim causality here. All I would claim is really a correlation that establishes the broader generalizability, say, of the argument whose to my mind plausibility really comes from the case studies, where I do think that in very detailed individual instances, I can show that the EU's influence is indeed causal. So in the SADC case, I have no doubt that the counterfactual would look very different had the EU not been around at that time with this funding support. We probably would have never seen the establishment of the SADC tribunal in 2005. It simply wouldn't have happened because member states didn't want it, right? So I think the case studies are more useful in that sense in establishing causality. Now for the global script, I did think about that a little bit. I try to control it in the quantitative analysis. Maybe I didn't talk about it. I do have a variable in there called global diffusion, which measures the average level of institutionalization in a given year. And that doesn't do much as far as I remember. The interesting about the EU is that the footprint that the EU leaves is quite distinct due to the fact that the EU is still quite distinct in terms of its signature institutions, right? There are very few things like the European Commission, like the European Parliament, like the European Court of Justice. So when one goes down to the level of these individual bodies, which I don't do in the quantitative analysis, I think the EU's influence is quite distinct in many ways and can therefore be established validly on the basis of the process tracing exercise. Now that gets lost in a highly aggregated measure that I use in the quantitative analysis. But the global script thing, telling from the case studies, I don't really see. I think the more valid potential criticism that I'm less confident about is whether some of these things came from other regional institutions with similar types of institutions. I try to control for that as much as I could in the case studies by asking people, and it was really the EU that was coming up in the interviews much more than other organizations. But you know, it's a possibility, and future research might want to control for these alternative influences in terms of diffusion more carefully in terms of the research design than I have done in this book. So in that sense, I see it as an important first step, but certainly not as the last and definitive statement that will resolve all issues forever. That might be an apt final word.
Yes, there's all good research. There's always room for further steps in that direction. So thank you so much to both Professor Tobias Lenz and Professor Collier-Albe for your conversation today, for sharing your research and your insights. And thank you also to our audience who have stuck with us despite our tardiness. Before leaving you, I would like to remind you that the Globe webinar series will continue this spring, starting with a webinar featuring Kenneth Abbott and Duncan Snedal on their new book, The Spectrum of International Institutions. You can register for that webinar at globe-project.eu, when you can see the rest of our spring lineup and also watch all previous episodes of the Globe webinar series. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. From all of us at the Globe Project, thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Tobias. Thanks, Alex.
Bye.
Thanks for the question.